Picking up from this aspect of clarifying framing, frames in the communication process are used in a number of ways, but we as communicators can make deliberate or even unintentional decisions when we're deciding what to say or what to write or what to present. And the text that we use can include or exclude keywords, phrases, images, sources, and sentences that reinforce a theme. And text here is used very broadly in this definition. As you can see, images is here, so it could be visual text, a movie, a video, as well as written text. Now, the receiver, according to this process, can interpret those frames that may or may not reflect the original intention of the communicator. You've probably experienced that at some point in your life where you said something and it was misinterpreted or misunderstood, and that can certainly happen to a receiver once we've identified the frame as the communicator. Entman also recognized that an individual's culture provides an inventory of common frames that are shared by people in a social group. So it could be things that we agree are important, like a strong work ethic, or things that we don't agree with, like when we hear that someone has been mistreated. And so the frames in the communication process are highlighting the communicator's text, receiver, and culture in the role of what frames do and say and what impact they have. Over time, this theory has proven itself as one that encourages a lot of research. So this study from 2007 did a meta-analysis and found these many studies in each of these time frames. And you can see that when this theory was first kind of getting its bearing, there were very few studies. And then all of a sudden, things have increased in this latest time frame included in this study. And I would argue that it has only continued to increase since this point in time. In agricultural communications, I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of scholars and graduate students to conduct framing studies. And I just want to highlight a few just to demonstrate that it is a common theory and used in AgCom, and it can be used to look at a variety of topics, such as antibiotic use in livestock, plant-based milk, the rural opioid epidemic, and even climate change. In addition, so these are ones that I wanted to highlight. I'm going to mention a few more here in just a moment. But first, I wanted to highlight that Schouffele said that there is this framing process model. And I know this might seem overwhelming at first, but what it's really trying to recognize is that there are different processes that are happening depending on where you are on this model and maybe what impact you want to have. So there's certainly this frame building where we have these inputs, organizational pressures, ideologies, attitudes, the media influence, maybe the media organization, and how that information would be presented. And that builds frames that are then presented in the media. And if you've seen any critiques on some of our big media conglomerates, they are getting criticized a bit because of this effort to build frames that are then shared through their media outlets. In addition to that, you could have media frames that then shape audience frames. So this frame setting is probably where we are most often concerned as researchers, because we want to see what are those media frames that are out there and what impact could that have on the audience when they are presented with them. Then we have audience frames, which are those individual level of effects of framing, which could influence these things. So you could present them with information, identify their frames, and what impact that may have on their attitudes and behaviors and other factors. And then finally, we have this journalist as audiences piece. So this is when the journalists are the ones that are bringing these factors into the situation, and combined with what their roles and responsibilities are, that could shape the frames they use. So this model captures a lot of the process of framing, and also the earlier model I showed you with the two circles, it recognizes that the media doesn't act alone, that there are people definitely engaged in this process, and how we interpret those frames can influence our own actions, our behaviors, and future frames that we might use. So based on those 4 circles on this chart that I just showed, there are these 4 areas that you could do research. So you could research frame building, and that's the process that would influence frames. You could look at the attributes that are making a frame important or more salient to an audience. You could look at individual effects of what do different frames, how do those impact the audience? And then how are journalists interpreting the issues? And when we study how journalists interpret information and present that subsequently. So a couple additional framing studies. These are additional studies from earlier framing work. So what we did was we identified what media frames were predominant in coverage of rural opioid epidemic. And then we created some frames and tested those to see what impact that might have on perceptions on the audience. And the similar study here, where we looked at what influence framing effects and the different characteristics that might, or the elements that might comprise a frame, would have on the public's opinion of antibiotic use in livestock. So framing can be done at a number of different levels, and certainly with a lot of different topics. So I just want you to reflect on that. What are those other agricultural or natural resources issues that need to be reframed, or we need to consider how they're being presented in order to encourage this society, our viewers, our readers, to take a different point of view? And then when you're doing that, who would be the sources that you'd want to see featured in those stories? So let me bring this back to this week's reading and what I'd like you to discuss on Blackboard. So frames should, according to Entman, define the problem, diagnose causes, make moral judgments, and suggest remedies. So which one of these do you feel that the media has put more emphasis in addressing wildfires? I asked you to read an article about how 10 major wildfires had been framed. And in that discussion, I hope that you could see these different elements of framing reflected in how the authors discuss that. So this assigned article identified the problem frame. It said that there are a couple different ways that this problem of wildfires could be presented in the media. And these were the categories they used. They also looked at the problem actors, or what I would call the sources. And these were the source categories they had. And through the article, which I have the citation here, they kind of visited and discussed, who are these actors that you see predominantly mentioned within each of the frames. And I just have a screenshot from a recent article that wildfires continue to be a threat, and some people actually think that it's going to only be increasing as we have more weather fluctuations, climate change, drought, and so on. So here are some other headlines that I pulled recently that feature the different ways that you could discuss wildfires. So this is about identifying the cause in Maui's fire. This is about some of the impacts that are going to happen, about insurance costs increasing. And then this is kind of the severity, the magnitude of the wildfires in British Columbia. So one topic, wildfires, could be presented in many different ways, and the articles themselves would have different sources. They would highlight different aspects of it, what they wanted to feature. And that's what the journalists would present as their frame. So what I want you to do is a mini framing study. The assigned reading examined these wildfires and how they've been presented in media coverage and the sources used. We know that we can look at many other agricultural and natural resource topics using a similar approach. So in this mini project, I want you to go search for news content about an agricultural and natural resource topic that interests you. Use that media bias chart if you want to look for maybe how two different media outlets are presenting the information. And identify at least 2 examples of how that topic is being framed differently in the media. So step 1, consider what you want to research. Step 2, go find 2 examples of how it's being discussed in the media, how it's being presented. So in your response on Blackboard, you'll introduce your topic briefly and include the headlines with links to 2 of these examples. And then just briefly tell me, how would you describe the frames? What types of sources did you notice in each of the articles? And based on what you've learned about framing theory, why might the journalists have chosen to use those frames in those particular examples? So that's what I'll have you do for your first discussion topic this week. So in review, we use framing to organize an experience. It helps us provide an account of what we experience and make sense of our everyday situations. Framing theory can be tied back to a lot of scholars, and I've mentioned a few here and in the presentation. Within media studies, these media frames are that central organizing idea or storyline, and they help us highlight some aspects of the story and eliminate others. And media framing studies can explore those 4 different aspects: frame building, frame setting, individual level effects, and the journalists as audience. And there's definitely a lot of potential to study how the media frames a variety of agricultural and natural resource topics and how those framing studies could be reflected in these 4 areas.